Welcome, my friends, to another in our devotions with Chaplain Dan this day. I'm Dan Bonner, one of the chaplains of our Wesleyan community, and it's a privilege to share with you something of the joy that comes from seeking the God we know and the life that God has in store for us. Today I want to turn to a very familiar story, one of the most well-known stories in all of Western society. You don't even have to be a Christian to know this story. The big story, I'll just run right through it, is you'll recognize Jesus was becoming a very, very popular open field preacher. And the throngs of people came to hear him. One day there was 5,000, the writer of John says, 5,000 gathered on a hillside in Galilee. And Jesus was standing before them, teaching and preaching to them about the kingdom of God. And as he looked around, he noticed, the story goes, that the day was growing closer and closer to supper time, and the people had been there all day very attentively listening to Jesus, and most of them had not come planning to stay that long, he suspected. They didn't have provisions for an evening meal. They were hungry. Maybe babies were crying way back in the back part of the gathering. The clues must have been obvious to him. Food was needed. 5,000. And no food brought and no food prepared. What shall we do? Well, Jesus turned to the disciples and said, I'm paraphrasing, but brothers, what do you think we should do? We've got 5,000 hungry people here. How do we get food? Where do we go and buy food? What do we do? And one of the disciples said, Master, we can't go and buy food. If we could, it would take 6 months of our wages as regular fishermen or regular artisans to pay for that much food. And there's no stores around here anyway, no shops. So Jesus, hearing this despondency and the recommendation from those disciples, just send them away, Master, that they may go and find food for themselves. Send them away, break up the meeting. But Jesus had another teachable moment in store for the throngs, but mostly, I think, for his disciples. Yes, they all had a big problem. How are we going to feed these folks? But Jesus also believed, knew, was part of a big God. And Jesus trusted that Godhead, that essence of creative and restorative and renewing and saving power, God his Father, trusted him to provide a way. And so he wanted to teach the disciples to trust in that same God. And he turned to those disciples who'd said, send them away, and he said instead, no, you feed them. What food do we have here? Don't tell me what we don't have. Tell me what food we do have. Now that's not a bad turn when we face dilemmas of great magnitude. Let me see what we do have that can address this need. And one of the disciples came up to him and said, well, Jesus, all we've got is a lad with 5 loaves of bread and a few fish. That's all that we can find. That I doubt if that was all the food there was, but it's all the food they could find. And so what Jesus said was the teachment phrase of faith in a mighty God bigger than even the biggest of our problems. Jesus said, bring the loaves and the fish to me. Thank the lad for them. Yes, this is contained in the 6th chapter of John's Gospel. You recognize the story now, I'm sure. And he took those 5 loaves and few fish, and he placed them on a pallet before him. And he bowed his head and called upon God to allow this to be a moment when God's power and presence might be made known in a compelling and transforming way. Then he raised his head and ordered the disciples, the 12, who didn't know what was going on, to take what was there on the pallet and began to distribute it, row by row, group by group, acre by acre of crowd. And after, I don't know how long, surely after sunset, it was obvious that everybody had been fed. Fed from what had originally been 5 loaves of bread and a few fish. How could that have been? How could that have been? I want to read what one of the disciples said as he gathered the fragments back of what was left over after everyone was fed. Philip came up to Jesus, one of the disciples, said, Master, we have 12 baskets full of fragments. And Jesus simply smiled. If you have a big problem, or I should say, when you or I up ahead have a big problem, a diagnosis from our doctor that is frightening, paralyzing, a fight between friends or family members that destroys long-developed relationships, nations fighting against nations, problems that you just don't know the answer to. Call upon God. We are children of the one who that day on the Galilean hill did just that. And just see what God has in store. My brothers and sisters, our biggest problems must be met by a God we fully trust in, who is bigger than any problem ever. How big is your God? What a privilege it is to share these questions and reflections with you. The wisdom comes not from this chaplain, certainly not from me, not from those disciples that day. They were perplexed, confused, dispirited, and not from the crowd. They were simply hungry. It came from Jesus, calling upon God to be God, and that to be enough. May you have a blessed rest of your day. Thank you for sharing this time with us. And know that our God is worth trusting that much. I'll see you next time. God bless.